I should have left Elderton the way I found it, untouched, barely a memory. A town I drove past on my way to somewhere else, nothing more than a blur on the map. But I stayed, and once I started asking questions, the town refused to let me go. The Elderton Historical Museum had offered me a temporary contract, 6 months to catalog their archives. It was a quiet position, the kind of work I had always preferred, dust-covered afternoons spent in solitude, flipping through old town ledgers, fragile photographs, and brittle newspaper clippings. No interruptions, no distractions. But from the very first week, I knew something was wrong. It started with the missing years. 1894 to 1896, gone. Not just from one archive, but from everything. Birth certificates, death notices, property records. Any mention of those years had been meticulously erased. Entire issues of the Elderton Gazette were absent from the microfilm reels. Ledgers had whole pages torn out, and cemetery registries had gaps where names should have been. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had made sure those years vanished. At first, I thought it was some bureaucratic failure, a fire in the records department, poor documentation practices in the 19th century. But the more I searched, the more deliberate it seemed. And it wasn't just in the archives. It was the town itself. People reacted strangely when I brought it up, too quickly dismissive, too eager to change the subject. It was like I had touched a nerve, an old wound that hadn't fully healed. The first few times, I thought I was imagining it. But when I noticed the way shopkeepers stiffened, how their polite smiles turned rigid at the mention of those years, I knew it wasn't paranoia. They weren't just forgetting. They were hiding something. The morning after I first discovered the missing records, I decided to do something I normally wouldn't: talk to people. I started with Margaret Holloway, the town's oldest resident and owner of Holloway's Bakery. She had been running the shop for over 70 years. If anyone knew about Elderton's past, it would be her. The bell chimed as I stepped inside. The scent of fresh bread and cinnamon wrapped around me, warm and familiar, but I couldn't shake the cold knot in my stomach. Margaret stood behind the counter, rolling out dough. Her lined face was sharp, perceptive. She eyed me as I approached. "Morning, dear," she greeted, flour dusting her knuckles. "You look troubled." I hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm working at the museum, sorting through old records," I said. "I noticed something odd. 1894 to 1896. There's nothing. No records, no newspapers. Do you remember anything about those years?" The shift in her expression was immediate. Her hands stilled, gripping the rolling pin just a little too tightly. Her mouth parted slightly, like she was about to answer. But then, "I don't remember," she said. Something about the way she said it sent a chill up my spine. Not "I don't know." Not "I was too young to recall." But "I don't remember." A practiced answer, a rehearsed lie. I held her gaze. Not even old stories, rumors. Her fingers curled, nails pressing into the dough. "Elderton is an old town, dear," she murmured. "Best to let sleeping ghosts lie." The way she said it, it sounded too polished, too final. like something she had told herself many times before. Before I could press further, the bell chimed behind me. A man entered. Tall, dark coat, stiff posture, a presence that filled the room. Deputy Rhodes. I recognized him from town hall meetings. He barely glanced at me as he approached the counter. "Morning, Mrs. Holloway," he said. His tone was polite, but something in it was firm. A warning. "Morning, Deputy Rhodes." Margaret's voice was warmer, but I caught the way her shoulders eased, like she had been holding her breath. Something passed between them, an understanding. Rhodes looked at me then, his expression unreadable. "Everything all right here?" Margaret hesitated. Then, just slightly, she shook her head. A silent message, a signal I wasn't meant to see. I left before they could say another word. Back at the museum, I tried a different approach. If the official town records had been tampered with, maybe personal records hadn't been. I searched for family trees, and that's when I noticed the pattern. Every family that had lived in Elderton during those years had gaps. Children who had no recorded deaths, no marriage records, entire family lines that simply stopped existing. Some residents, one still living, had parents and grandparents with missing histories. Their ancestors were ghosts. I started comparing names between census reports, searching for inconsistencies. Something was off. Some names were completely erased. Others were crossed out, but faintly visible beneath layers of ink. Some had been rewritten, dates altered, surnames changed, entries manipulated. And then I saw it. A name, barely legible in the margins of an old census report. Eleanor Bishop. Her name wasn't part of any official record. It had been written in the margins, as though someone had been trying to remember her, or trying to keep her from being forgotten. I flipped through other documents. There it was again. A signature at the bottom of a property deed. A scribbled reference in a ledger from a closed-down shop. A faint mention in a doctor's notes. Eleanor Bishop had existed, and yet officially, she never had. I looked at the museum's oldest town directory, desperate for any official trace of her. Instead, I found something worse. A faint indentation on a torn-out page. Someone had erased her. Not forgotten, erased. The discovery of Eleanor Bishop's name should have been a breakthrough. Instead, it felt like a warning. I spent hours combing through every document, every record I could find. But her name was always on the edges, never in the center. A reference here, an annotation there, always written by hand, as if she had been added as an afterthought, as if someone had tried to preserve her memory in secret. The only place I hadn't searched was the restricted section. Locked away in a temperature-controlled room, the museum's oldest documents were stored under strict preservation orders. The public wasn't allowed access, and I technically wasn't either. But the curator, Mr. Calloway, wasn't around, and the key had been left on his desk. I told myself it wasn't breaking in if I had the key. The restricted archives smelled different, older, damp. Some of the books had spines so brittle I was afraid to touch them. I ran my hands along the leather covers, searching for anything dated near 1894. Then I saw it, a ledger bound in black cloth, its spine unmarked. I flipped it open. The ink had faded, but the first page was still legible. Elderton Parish Death Registry, 1894 to 1896. The years that weren't supposed to exist. My pulse quickened as I skimmed the names. Most were what I expected: old age, sickness, accidents. But then I saw something strange. The same date of death appeared over and over. April 7th, 1896. Dozens of names, entire families. Some had no recorded cause of death. Others were marked only with a single word: removed. At the very bottom of the list, the ink smudged as if someone had tried to erase it, was a name that made my skin crawl. Eleanor Bishop. Removed. I traced my fingers over the ink, my breath catching. What had happened on April 7th, 1896? And why had the town buried it? A threat in the dark. A noise made me freeze. Footsteps. Someone else was in the museum. I carefully placed the ledger back on the shelf and turned off my flashlight. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving just outside the restricted section. I barely dared to breathe. Had someone seen me come in? The handle to the door rattled. Then came the voice, low and calm. "I know you're in there." Deputy Rhodes. I kept still. Maybe he would leave. "I need you to put back whatever you took," he said, his tone measured. "And come out." I had no choice. Swallowing hard, I stepped out of the restricted section, leaving the ledger behind. Rhodes stood in the dim hallway, arms crossed. "You're digging in places you shouldn't." I forced a casual shrug. "Just doing my job." "This isn't your job," he said. "This is our town, and we don't like outsiders stirring up the past." I stared at him, feeling the weight of his words. Not a warning, a threat. But then, just for a second, his eyes flickered. Not with anger, but with something else. Guilt, fear. I took a gamble. "You know, don't you?" His jaw tightened. "I saw the records," I continued, watching him closely. "Something happened here. Something on April 7th, 1896. And you're all still covering it up." He exhaled slowly, then took a step closer. His voice was quiet, meant only for me. "I don't know what you think you found, but some things are buried for a reason." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the dark, with the weight of history pressing against my chest. I needed more. I needed someone who would talk. I remembered an article I had read my first week in town. Walter Grayson, a former historian, had been writing a book about Elderton's past when he suddenly stopped and disappeared from public life. Rumors said he had gone mad. Others said he had learned something he wasn't supposed to. Either way, I had to find him. His house sat at the edge of town, half hidden by overgrown trees. The windows were covered with newspaper, and the paint had peeled away in patches. It looked abandoned. But when I knocked, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, thin, hunched, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion in his face. "Mr. Grayson," I said, "I need to talk to you about 1896. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past me, scanning the empty street before nodding me inside. The house smelled of old paper and dust. Every surface was covered in notes, photographs, hand-drawn maps. The walls themselves were lined with yellowed pages, a conspiracy pinned together with string. Grayson shut the door, locked it, then turned to face me. "You found her name, didn't you?" "Yes," I said. "Eleanor Bishop." Grayson let out a shuddering breath. She was just one of them. A chill ran down my spine. "One of who?" Grayson motioned toward a stack of folders. The others, the ones they erased. He handed me a faded photograph. A group of people stood in front of the old town square. Men, women, children. Their expressions were blank, their posture rigid. But something was off. Half of them had been scratched out. I flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back were 3 words that sent a shiver through my bones. The vanishing day. I looked up at Grayson, my throat dry. What happened to them? He swallowed hard. They were taken. Walter Grayson's words clung to the air between us. They were taken. A phrase that should have belonged to ghost stories and whispered myths. But the fear in his eyes told me this wasn't folklore. It was real. I sat down across from him, the cracked leather chair sagging under my weight. Taken where? Grayson rubbed a hand over his face, fingers tracing the deep lines etched into his skin. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in years. They called it the vanishing day, he murmured. It wasn't just Eleanor Bishop. There were families, children, an entire part of the town wiped out overnight. People woke up on April 7th, 1896, and the others were just gone. I swallowed hard. And no one ever questioned it? He gave a bitter laugh. They questioned it. And then they disappeared too. A chill spread through me. So it's still happening. His expression darkened. Not the way it did back then, but the town still remembers. The ones who ask too many questions, they go missing. Not in the way you'd expect. People don't just leave. It's like they were never here. My mind reeled. That's why the records were erased. That's why the town was afraid. They don't kill them, Grayson whispered, leaning in. They erase them, like they never existed at all. The weight of it pressed against my chest. My instincts screamed at me to get out of Elderton while I still could, but I had already come too far. If you really want to know what happened, Grayson said, there's only one place left to look. I tensed. Where? He hesitated. Then he pointed to a map pinned to the wall, an old layout of Elderton. But something was different. At the southern edge of town, there was a marked location, labeled the sinkhole. It's not a sinkhole, Grayson said. That's just what they started calling it after they covered it up. My pulse pounded. What is it really? He exhaled. A mass grave. The words punched the air from my lungs. They buried them there, he continued, his voice hollow. The ones who vanished. The ones who asked too many questions. The ones they wanted erased. My hands shook as I traced my fingers over the map. Had I just uncovered a mass murder? I should have left. I should have packed my bags, driven out of Elderton, and never looked back. But instead, I found myself standing at the edge of the sinkhole just before midnight, flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. The area had been fenced off, overgrown with weeds and brush. A weathered no trespassing sign hung loosely from the chain-link barrier. Beyond it, the earth dipped into a shallow depression, a scar where something had been buried and forgotten. I climbed over the fence. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, too soft, as if something rotten lay beneath it. The air smelled different here, damp, stale, tinged with something unnatural. I moved carefully, sweeping my flashlight over the dirt. Then I saw it. a fragment of bone jutting from the soil. My stomach lurched. I knelt down, brushing away the loose dirt. More bones, dozens of them. Then something else. Wood. A broken fragment of a wooden plank, half buried in the dirt. I wiped the soil away and saw faded carved letters. Eleanor Bishop. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a grave. It was a warning. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, my flashlight catching movement in the trees. A figure, watching. Then another, and another. Dozens of them, standing at the tree line, unmoving, their faces obscured by the night. They had been waiting for me. Then, a voice. Low, familiar. You should have left. Deputy Rhodes. I backed away from the sinkhole, heart hammering. The figures stepped closer. Rhodes walked ahead of them, his expression unreadable. You couldn't leave it alone, could you? I forced my voice to stay steady. This is murder. No, he said quietly. This is balance. I shook my head. You erased them. We did what we had to. I realized then that the town wasn't just hiding the past. They were preserving the silence. Something happened here. Something that had to be buried again and again to keep Elderton from falling apart. And now, I was part of it. You can still walk away. I looked at the bones, the name, the ghosts of a town that refused to remember. I thought of Eleanor, of the people who had been erased before me. I had a choice. Leave, forget, become part of the silence, or dig. I took one step back, and then another, and then I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. By the time I reached the highway, I realized something horrifying. I couldn't remember the road out of town. My mind felt scrambled, my memories slipping like sand through my fingers. I knew what I had found, but the details were fading. The town wasn't just erasing people. It was erasing the truth. I pulled out my phone, shaking fingers scrolling through my notes. But the photos I had taken, the names, the ledgers, gone. I gripped the wheel, my breath shallow. Elderton wasn't a town that forgot. It was a town that made you forget. And now, it was waiting for me to let go too.